Black people are being found hanging from a tree all across America. And they're ruling it suicides. Why are they ruling these deaths suicides? When there's no evidence in many of these cases that they are suicides. There aren't notes left behind. Families are claiming they were not suicidal. They haven't had previous suicide attempts. At least this information have not been released to the public. And if they have had previous suicide attempts, or if they left a note, why not release that information to the public? Because that'll calm a lot of us down right now. If we knew that they actually committed suicide, we won't be as upset. I mean, they're willing to take down statues. They're willing to change images on products to calm protest. But they're not willing to release suicide notes or evidence that it is actually a suicide. No, because there's no evidence. See, here's the thing about a suicide. There's a few rulings. That's a few things that they can, according to the CDC medical examiner's manual, there's only a few, there's something like 10 different features of a suicide that if these features exist, they can call it a suicide. It's extremely ambiguous. Hey, evidence evidence that rescue was impossible. It literally says, if the victim has made extra precautions to prevent rescue, it can be deemed a suicide. What does that mean? That means someone can be hung in the middle of a forest, and because they're not easily rescued, it can be deemed a suicide. Ridiculous, right? So what rulings are they using to rule these are suicides? Another thing. Statements of hopelessness. This is coming directly from the CDC manual. If someone had made a statement of hopelessness in the time of COVID-19, who aren't depressed, right? Sitting in the house for months. Of course, I mean, I think everyone on my friends list is like, I'm tired of sitting in the house on these months. I'm gaining weight. I am bored out of my mind, right? What's next? Statements of hopelessness. If a victim dies and I've made a previous statement of hopelessness, it can be deemed a suicide. That's straight out of the CDC manual. There's others. Another one. Okay, I just checked my CDC manual. This is ridiculousness. Stressful events are serious losses. Is COVID considered a stressful event? Without a doubt. Without a doubt. So, can't believe this thing. Like, calling these things suicide, while the families are blatantly saying that my family member was not suicidal. Right? He didn't leave or feel well. Everything was fine yesterday. No previous history of suicide attempts. Working people. Families, family men and women found hung. And here's one of the things that's really shocking. 2 of the victims were found hung within an hour and a half of each other. Outside, one was in Victorsville and another one was in Palmsdale. Hour, 10-minute drive from each other. Never had contact with each other. Never. Don't know each other. Not Facebook friends or Twitter friends or Instagram, whatever you call them, followers or whatever. If that isn't suspicious, what is? Black women, in general, African Americans have the lowest suicide risk of all the tracked races in America. Given our goddamn history, we should have the highest. Given what's been happening to African Americans for 400 years, should have the highest. But no, we learned to cope. And because we've learned to cope, we've been prepared. We've prepared for situations like coronavirus or COVID-19. Now, African American suicide in America is something like 5 per 100,000 or something, or 5 per 1,000 or something. Caucasians are 5 times more likely. 5 times more likely. And that's generalizing African Americans. Women, black women, are 2 times less likely to commit suicide than black men. But African Americans in general, the lowest suicide rate in America. And you're going to tell me that 2 African Americans was found an hour and 10 minutes from each other, hung by suicide? When hanging and suffocation only accounts of 30% of suicide attempts. And that's when they don't, and typically hanging and suffocation is when you don't have access to other weapons. Other methods like splitting your throat or firearms, or if you're in prison. And this is where statistics fails us, because they lump in drowning and hanging. They put it all in the same category because it's death by suffocation, right? And then they also looked in like prison suicides. Yes, hanging in prison is common because you don't have access to sharp objects or you don't have access to firearms, so people hang themselves with shoestrings or whatever. If we removed suicides in prison, right? If we removed suicides in prison, the rate of African American suicides would be lower. The rate of African American suicides by hanging will be lower. So it is statistically significant that 2 black people, Americans, were found, hung, or lynched within an hour and a half or hour and 10 minutes of each other. And it's called a suicide. See, this is why we are fighting the system. The system allows them to rule it a suicide. The CDC manual allows them to rule it as suicide. We're not fighting cops. We're not protesting militia groups. We are fighting against a system, and we need to focus on these systems, these manuals, these rules, these regulations, these laws that allows these cops to get away with murder, that allow these militia groups to get away with murder. The CDC manual to allow someone to be declared suicidal, declared a murder or suicide because it's within their rules and regulations. The same thing with Stand Your Ground in Florida. It's their rules and regulations. This is what we are fighting against. The reason why they can lock up so many black men in the effort to disarm Black America is because it's in the rules and regulations. The reason why prison labor exists is because you can be enslaved based by the 13th Amendment. It's the rules and regulations. So, as we move on in this protest in America, and we move on and we attempt to garner attention and attempt to gain progress, we need to really focus on changing these rules and regulations, these laws, this Constitution, to be more equitable and to undo historical injustices to Black and brown people, not only in the world, not only in America, but all over the world. That's my perspective. Till next time.